Good day and thanks for watching. My name is Leon and I'm the lead developer of RAC by Data Prime. Now this video is going to introduce you to a new addition to our audit programs within RAC, and that is the introduction of Stratum within the audit program. Now just to give you a little bit of a background, those who are familiar with RAC, you'll know that in our audit programs you're able to go and identify exactly what assertions and components each and every procedure addresses. However, within certain components there is a need for what we've started terming stratum within that component. So for instance, if we look at something like trade and other payables, you may have a procedure that tests your trade creditors but not necessarily your other accruals. And that is what the stratum is coming in to do. It's giving you the opportunity to design a procedure that will address a specific stratum and not necessarily the component as a whole. And to show you an example, I'm going to go through a fairly basic property, plant and equipment audit program. So as I open up the audit program, you'll see that there's now a new sheet that has come in called Stratum. And if I open that up, what shows now is for the components that are applicable to this audit program, we have pre-populated some stratum, and in the case of property, plant and equipment, we've got additions and disposals. However, we haven't necessarily populated all stratum that you may want to use. If you want to add additional stratum, you can do so within each and every audit program. As you can see, these cells are green. Yes, there's a long formula. That's just to bring through the information from the source, which is 10.20, where you can also go and now add stratum. There's also a stratum sheet that is being added there. Alright, now you can choose to make use of the stratum, or you can choose to ignore the stratum. It's entirely up to you. Alright, for this case I'm going to make use of both of those stratum, and then also what comes in is we're asking a question here whether the evidence needs to be the same as your audit plan, or must it all be substantive tests of detail. Now the importance of this question is, let's say for instance PPE, you've decided to do some control testing. However, you get to this point, you want to test additions as a stratum, but you don't necessarily want to do control testing over additions because maybe there's been very few additions in the year. You can then here go and choose to test with entirely substantive tests of detail rather than following the audit plan. Alright, and what that will do is when we get to our audit program, you now no longer get any desired assurance from control testing for your additions, even though you may have desired control testing for your overall component. Now very importantly here, the main component or the main portion of any component does not necessarily need to be given its own stratum. So for instance, property, plant and equipment, the balances I would consider the main portion of the component. We don't have a year-end balance stratum in here. Where we design the procedures, you'll see how we deal with the main stratum versus the substratum. Now initially on our audit program, there's nothing new here. We start with our standard procedures. Those are all in place, and we don't in the standard procedures go and allocate these to any particular stratum. These are just procedures we need to go and do. We get to our test to control. I'm just going to scroll down to our block at the bottom here, and what you'll see is our remaining plan control assurance is now sitting. There's a 2 and a 1 for property, plant and equipment. I have pre-prepared the audit plan, so that's why there are some values here already. And you'll see additions is blank because we've said additions we're going to get just substantive test of detail. And just to show you what happens with disposals, we've said in accordance with the audit plan, it's exactly linked with the audit plan. Now I have selected a large entity here, so the assertions covered include separate items for class and transactions, account balance and disclosures. If you select a medium, small or micro client, the same rules will apply. You'll only just have fewer assertions listed on your audit program. So just to go again quickly through the procedure design process, go and put in a procedure. Importantly, are we going to perform this procedure? Yes, we are. What component does it cover? Property, plant, and equipment. Now that's the overall component at this stage. What assertions? Let's go and say completeness. And now the important question is, which stratum will this cover? Okay, go now hit the drop down list, and only the stratum for property, plant, and equipment are listed. So let's go and add this one to disposals. Okay, and we go and we say our desired level of assurance here is 2. Okay, what happens? Just the 2 from my disposals is removed. The other option here is you can go and say all, which will include property, plant, equipment, and additions and disposals, and any other stratum you may have selected. So there are some valid procedures that will cover all the stratum, or you can leave it blank, in which case it will only cover the main component or the main part of that component and not any of the substratum. That's why I say we don't need to specifically go and allocate the main balance or the main items into its own stratum. The assumption is when it's blank, that is what it is using. The other thing I just want to point out for you is if I go and select multiple components, and if we go and allocate it to a stratum, it's going to give me red lines here. The reason for this is it's just not possible to go and have a procedure that addresses multiple components and specific stratum at the same time. So we are trying our best to make the audit program as user-friendly as possible. What we didn't want to do was have multiple columns here for different stratum. It just gets a bit complicated and a bit over the top. So what we're doing is we're using this drop-down system, but the limitation of the drop-down system is the procedure must then address one particular stratum, if please. Okay, let me just go and show you. Let's just say, for instance, you did have a procedure that covered multiple items. Just go and say refer procedure above, and just go and document the additional components and stratum and assertions that it may on a separate procedure, and then just reference both to the same working paper. That's the best option available at this stage. Okay, I'm going to go and say all to this procedure, and you'll see that it makes everything blank. However, you will also note that it doesn't do anything to additions. It doesn't say additions is now -2, because we've said additions is not applicable. We're not testing the additions with this control, so it does at least have the logic not to give you massive negatives on items that you're not covering. Let's just go and add another procedure here quickly. Once again, important, yes, is it going to be performed? Properly plant and equipment. Let's go for existence now, and we're going to leave that blank. That's to go to the overall, and we go for procedure 3. Is to be performed properly plant and equipment, existence, and in this case we want to go and test disposals, and once again please remember the desired level of assurance. Okay, doing a control test on our depreciation, and it is to cover completeness and occurrence. There are no stratum, and desired level 2. Okay, so we're left with a slight negative under my depreciation. That's not a problem, it is acceptable, and you'll see in some cases you might end up with fairly large negatives in these cells. That is okay. It's just a warning that you may be over auditing, but that doesn't override professional judgment whether you want to perform the procedure anyway. Okay, I'm going to scroll down quickly. If we go to the substantive analytical, you'll see that the exact same setup is here. Obviously it's different assertions that are being covered here now, but once again additions, that's blank because I've said additions needs to be substantive tests of detail. Okay, let me just go and put a couple of procedures in here. Okay, that addresses all my substantive analytical assurance. Now those are fairly easy. When you get to analytical procedures or control tests, you've got to go and put in the procedures, please. We can't design those procedures on your behalf. However, when we get to our substantive tests of detail, I've gone to great lengths to ensure that for all of the major components, there are now procedures in place for all the assertions. in as many of those components as possible. So the process should be a little bit easier going forward. And in fact, when you're using small or micro enterprises, this will now actually automatically populate. We assume that all the procedures will be done and there's no customization necessary anymore. However, this is a large client, so I don't go and make any assumptions for you. So we need to go and document what procedures are going to be performed. What we've done is, again, for some of the major components, what we've done is we will automatically populate some of these stratum for you, even on a large entity. So when you get to a position like this, you'll see there's a fairly complicated formula sitting in there. The reason that's popping out is you'll see in the procedure, we've put a little special character in and we've listed additions. So what it's saying is that this procedure, we consider this a part of the additions stratum. If we go a little bit further down, the presentation and disclosure, for instance, here we're saying that should be part of all. So here's a procedure that is automatically populated for you. You can go and say yes, and it will automatically take in the stratum. You are welcome to change that. So if you're not using the addition stratum, you can change it if necessary. But in this case, I'm going to go and say desired level of assurance 4 for additions, because I know we are doing these just with substantive tests of detail, just to hopefully save me a little bit of work later on. Okay, scroll down, presentation and disclosure, that's got all. Now again, there are some procedures that are going to be listed that aren't linked to a specific stratum, but still, as we had before, these are just additional procedures that we want to go and consider. And here we have something like our borrowing costs. Okay, I want my clerks to perform that procedure, but the assurance that it's going to give me at the end of the day is not overall assurance on any stratum or substratum. So I'm going to leave the desired level of assurance blank, but I still want to go and perform that procedure. So I'll go and list those. Again, many of these may actually be not applicable and you won't perform them. I'm just going to document them with a yes for now. Okay, we get to depreciation. It doesn't have any stratum. We're not using any stratum, so there I don't need to document anything under stratum. Go to presentation and disclosure and desired level of assurance 1. Let me scroll down and have a look at what my table looks like. Okay, now because I documented a 4 on those additions, you'll see that I've actually done fairly well, but there's still a 3 popping out on disclosure. So to quickly have a look at that, I recall there's a disclosure procedure, and that covers all assertions. Go and increase the level of assurance for that to a 4. Scroll down, and the disclosures are all sitting at zeros. Okay, that's the process. Let's just go and quickly document a couple of procedures here. Now just quickly on the depreciation, once again there are fairly comprehensive procedures on depreciation. All I need to go and do is increase my desired level of assurance here for those depreciation procedures. Scroll down. Okay, great, we're covered, and I go to my conclusion and it's telling me my planning has been completed adequately. Okay, that is the preparation of the audit program with a stratum. Please make use of this feature. It will make your audit programs a little bit more detailed and compliant. It'll help you distinguish between some of these procedures. For instance, as I say, if we're doing tests on items like trade and other payables, or even trade and other receivables, you have trade debtors and other debtors. You might need to design different procedures for the different types of stratum within that component, and you are now able to. In the past, what we were saying was don't put a desired level of assurance in, go and document a level of assurance under the comments, but now you don't need to do that. You can make use of the stratum. The exception is going to be some of these unusual items like this borrowing costs test and the leases test that are sitting specifically under PPE. However, what you may note as you are working through this is obviously this procedure is not applicable to this entity based on which entity you might be performing, or alternatively you might be saying, listen, I need to go and make a stratum for one of these items, and you can go and assign these procedures then to one of those stratum. Okay, Just one thing further, the change in audit approach has also been updated. So you will also there, if you're needing to do any change in audit approach because some of your procedures didn't work out, there is also a facility to go and allocate it to a specific stratum in our change in audit approach now as well. That's all from me for now. Thanks very much for listening. Have a great day. Cheers.